So, good morning everybody. Good morning, good evening. I haven't slept a lot this night. Please welcome here at the opening speech of this year's circle of Literárněvědné forum. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome here a colleague of mine, Maciej Maryl, who is director of the Center for Digital Humanities of Institute for Literary Research in Warsaw, and he is here within the mobility project which we are working at the moment with the colleague from Institute of Literary Research from Warsaw and Poznań. So vítáme bardzo pięknie naszych kolegów z Instytutu Badań Literackich tutaj w Pradze. I don't know if it's necessary to say a lot of words about Maciej, because I think that or the majority of you really would know Maciej's activities and Maciej personally. So maybe I will add only few details. Maciej has graduated in sociology, applied sociology, yeah, and Polish literature, and in his scientific career he deals with the problem related to the literary life on internet or online literary life, and also with the task or with the question related to digital humanities. He is active in the Polish Daraya, in the consortium called Operas, and so on. So it will be a long list to name all of the institutions and working group on which Maciej is taking a part. So I think it doesn't really make sense to go through every of them. Maybe I would mention only one last thing for the end of my opening speech. Maciej was awarded in 2010, if I remember good, with Fulbright Junior scholarship, and in 2017 he has got Fulbright Senior scholarship. So maybe we can expect that in 2024 he will get the scholarship for retirement. But we will see. But Maciej will today present us our work or his research that he has done in Stanford University within this Fulbright scholarship in the spring of this year. Is that true? Yeah. So that's the task for today. Maciej, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Good evening, a public day, and I'm really honored to be here. And thank you very much for the invitation for speech. And I remember we met like in exactly the same room like 3 years ago, and we sort of re-established cooperation between our institutions. So I'm really happy that it's still ongoing, that every year some people from our institute come here, and we can also host you in Poland, Warsaw or Poznań, which is really great. So I almost feel like home here. So that's really really nice. And also thank you for coming here so late, because we started like a bit later than you usually do, because we attended another workshop today. But I tried to be concise, and I tried to be as much as entertaining as I can at this hour. So as Wojta kindly mentioned, the work I'm presenting here is a part of something I was working on while on Fulbright scholarship. And my task was sort of pretty simple. I just wanted to use our resources of our literary bibliography, the Polish Literary Bibliography, to try to do some quantitative research into literary culture. So just to see how the bibliography, which is normally used as basically a resource or a certain or a place where you go when you start to do research, you're looking for hints, or you're looking for literature, for some references, how to turn it into actually a tool through which we can observe literary life, literary system. So, the main challenge of the project, and I told you if you sit over there you probably cannot read it, but I'll just try to tell you what's here. The main challenge of the project is basically was to try to see how the data set of Polish literary bibliography would work if we try to map some processes of literary life. So in order to do so, I sort of thought about a really simple, I think very simple procedure, which is basically trying to look at the scholarly claims concerning Polish literature of the 90s, and just to try to see whether we can recreate those hypotheses using the data from the Polish literary bibliography. So in this way, just to try to calibrate some tools to see if actually the processes which are described by literary scholars are replicable through the data. So the main point was, and this is the pointer to basically take those hypotheses by literary scholars and try to work with them through the data of Polish bibliography, and then of course to propose some methodology for data-driven studies into literary life, and finally to suggest some recommendation for literary documentation. So just try to see like what sort of data is useful, what can we do to get better data. So these are like those three goals, and here I'm basically focusing on the first part just to show you how I try to make the Polish data set work with those claims. So the transition period. I chose the transition period in Polish literature like for the mere reason that this is the main period we have actually enough data for. That was one of the choices, but also because of the fact that what made it easier is that we have lots of literary criticism concerning this period, the early 90s. So many critics try to sort of analyze, synthesize the process of transition, try to write about it. So there are like many hypotheses. It's like a really interesting period. I mean, on the other hand, I wouldn't say it's like literature-wise, it's an interesting period. I wouldn't say that. I mean, I don't think the Polish literature of the 90s is like particularly interesting, but those actions of critics trying to sort of frame it are, in my opinion, quite interesting. So there's a crash course on like or structure of Polish literary life, but just to give you the background, the overview. So straight after the war, we had sort of like a mixed model. There were still some private enterprises reopening after the war, but quickly after nationalization of copyrights, and they were pushed into bankruptcy, and basically starting with the 50s. We have state monopoly of publishing, or kind of something you know too well. And starting with 76, I mean, of course, we had like some illegal publication before then, but we sort of with periodization, we started with 76 with establishing dual model of drugi obieg of Stanisław circulation. And then there's 99, and we have the moment of transition. So we have this, and it's of course, again, it's just a date in itself, because it's really hard to pinpoint the actual moment when the transition happens. I mean, both in terms of politics, because yeah, in Poland again, we have some struggles, like whether we should call the first elections, like the transition point, etc. In terms of literature, maybe it's like I think April 1990 when the censorship was abolished. I don't really know, but I'll just take this date as a sort of moment of transition, and now I look forward with my data set on this period. And again, 2002 is the sort of ending period, but only because of the fact that we have data. I mean, we have a bit more data, but when I was doing the research, 2002 was the last year where we had we have a complete sort of resource in the Polish literary bibliography. So now some views on transition by Polish critics. And I told you, this period from the critical point of view is really interesting because the critics use lots of interesting metaphors to describe what was going on. So starting with the early 90s, so let's say more or less like the first half of the 90s. First of all, we had something called by Jerzy Jarzemski the appetite for change. So basically, in thinking about literary transition, there was like this assumption that since we have political, economical, etc. transitions, there has to be some breakthrough, there has to be something new, some new quality. So actually the critics themselves sort of expected the breakthrough in literature. And yeah, I remember actually from the 90s, for instance, those calls, we need like big novels for those times, whatever, but they actually didn't appear so much. We didn't get like the literature that was really expected. The period that actually this hypothesis would probably concerns also like the late 30s by Janusz Sławicki, eminent Polish structuralist, which is actually probably one of my favorite papers in the Polish literary scholarship. It's like a 3-pager, but it's probably one of the mostly quoted paper in the Polish literary studies, because basically Sławicki describes what's going on in the literary life around the late 80s, and to explain the disappearance of the center. By center he meant something like the center of like literary taste and attention. So before that we knew, I mean, who's the good writer, who's the point of reference. And in the late 80s he observed that there are like many sub-centers, we call it like Microworld, established with new authors, with smaller like readership groups, and everything went sort of, everything became dispersed in a way. And a similar claim is made by Babłajewski, who's writing about the early 90s. It's like a state of dispersion, basically, using this spatial metaphor that we don't have anymore those big players, those big national players as well, but we have the plurality of tastes or local publishers, local authors, local audiences. And in a similar manner, there's one more metaphor for this time, Movemove Markets by Chaplinsky. So basically, his claim would be that there's like this sort of flexible relationship between center and periphery. So there's no established center, and basically it moves sort of all over. So something that could be considered or was considered periphery suddenly becomes the center of attention, and the other way around. So there's like a sort of a need for structure, or rather the argument is that basically everything is so dispersed, it's hard to talk about like one or like the main literary culture of that period. But in the late 90s, this trend sort of seems to reverse, at least in writings by the critics. So just to give you again some examples, Kim Gadunin would call this period the period of normalization, basically. So also the moment when literature becomes less important in overall like media landscape. So mass media became more eminent, like movies, also like magazines, journals, etc. So literature becomes like one of the discourses. But Babłajewski would write about the return of the old masters. So basically, he would say that in the early 90s there was something he called the debutocentrism. So this need for new writers, for debutants. So lots of attention put into literary debuts. Whereas starting like with mid 90s, the attention would shift towards the old masters. By old masters, he meant basically the authors who were big before 1989. So, for instance, Szymborska, Miłosz, Herbert. Also, I think that the Nobel Prize for Szymborska would help actually sort of in this perceived shift towards those big eminent authors. Around this time, Czapinski would say that the margins, which used to be flexible, got sort of fixed, and he would proclaim the sort of return of the center, meaning that if we started with disappearance of the center, considered as a sort of also like this official national literary culture. Now we have return of the center in terms of a basically market, book market or capitalist market society. So now the big players are big commercial publishers which sort of dominate the market. So in this sense, we have the return of the center, we have the commercialized literary culture. So this is like this crash course into discourses, Polish discourses about the 90s, but basically just to give you the overview of what was going on in literary criticism. So I'm sorry again for so much text on the screen, but I basically took those claims and just constructed some hypotheses we may test using the data from Polish Literary Bibliography. So the main hypothesis would be that basically the post-1989 dispersion of the literary system basically got recentralized in the late 90s according to market principles. And detailed hypothesis would be as follows. So first of all, one, the institutions of literary life undergo dispersion in the early 90s and subsequently return to the more centralized model. Hypothesis number two, that literary reception, in reviews and criticism, would follow the same pattern. Hypothesis number three is relying on this idea of debutocentrism and return of the old masters. So basically, that literary reception of the dispersed phase is focused on debutants, whereas in this recentralization phase, the reception of reviewers concentrate on these old masters. And the last one, the last hypothesis would be that the processes of dispersion and recentralization also have a geographical dimension. So basically, it should be visible as the rise and eventual decline of smaller publishing centers. So these are basically four hypotheses which are possible to be tested with the material from PBL, from Polish Literary Bibliography. So what comes now is the operationalizations, which is basically I try to translate those hypotheses into basically the measurements we can do with our data. And Franco Moretti calls operationalization as the process of building a bridge from concepts to measurement. And that will be basically what we're going to do here. So basically, in our case, from the concepts of literary history to bibliographical data. However, and this is just a footnote here, but there was like a quite important paper recently by Catherine Bolt criticizing some distant reading practices by Moretti, and she would call for something she dubbed bibliographical consciousness. So basically, that we should be aware, that we should be able to say what sort of data we have, what shortcomings our data have. So what were the how the data was produced actually, in order to make any sort of judgments on them. And I think, at least in our bibliographical team, there is a huge methodological consciousness of how this data is produced. So what's in our database, what's not there, and what sort of claim we can make. So I try to use this knowledge when constructing those operationalizations. So Polish Literary Bibliography, I don't know if I should introduce it here, but basically, really quickly, it's a literary bibliography which registers all articles, notes, and other materials concerning literary life, and we have lots of records concerning authors' work, reviews, articles, awards, events, exhibitions, also with some semantic and with the system of subject classification. And in our project, our research project, which was recently sort of concluded in a way, but we look forward to get some more funding to keep it going. We tried to turn it into the research tool, looking at those connections. And my work here is also sort of part of this larger idea of how to use this data to make it work with for research. So let's move towards the, oh sorry, it's not this way. Just a quick look at the data. And my data is basically a data set downloaded from TPL and sort of curated for many reasons. And I can give you details if anybody's interested, but I would not like to get stuck on it. But basically, what I did, I took the data from 1999 to 2002, and through certain cleaning procedures, which are, which we leave out for now, we ended up with this sort of number of works. So 33,000 books about literature and almost 140,000 journal pieces, being poems, short stories, essays, etc. So these are like literary works. Also, we got almost 100,000 reception pieces, meaning articles about authors, interviews, notes and books, and I took only those which were related to either author or a book. So we have this connection that this is a piece about somebody's work. So in the data set we have 21,000 writers, almost 1,000 journals, and 8,000 publishers. So this is this big data set I'm working with here. And this data is sort of connected with each other through certain fields as well. And I didn't use many of those measurements here, but this is like just to give you the example of what we can take from this data I worked with. So for writers or critics, we get name, surname, and gender. I used some of the algorithm just to guess the gender of the author. For books, we have like writer name, title, publisher, city. In some cases, genre. In some cases, length, whether it's translation or not, etc. And so on, so on. And in reception pieces, as I mentioned, we have a critic, so who wrote it, title, journal, city, genre of the writing. In some cases, length. And so on. So we have those various variables we can try to make work for our cause, and the cause is just try to find the same phenomena as was described by critics of this literary period. So starting with this hypothesis number one. So basically that the institutions undergo dispersion in the first part of the 90s, and then recentralisation. So the operationalization here would be this translation from concepts to measurements would entail here basically the fact that dispersion of literary production entails an increase in number of smaller publishers, journals, or basically publishing centers disseminating literary content over time. So that the smaller players would appear and would be more prolific, so to say. And recentralisation would mean the reverse, so smaller number of big players is overtaking the literary communication. So that's the first graph. Okay, you'll see the title here. The title reads, here, it reads Evolution of the Literary Field, 1989-2002. And you don't see the years here, so you know what, just a second. Smaller so you can see the scale. Yeah, that's a good. So, as you can see in this example, okay, and it's what we have here. So, this is the line. This represents the literary journal pieces published. So, literary output published in journals. This is the number of active literary authors. This is the number of literary books published, number of active literary publishers, and number of active literary journals. And in all cases, we can see the sort of, and there's a trend line, so sort of growth in numbers. So steady growth of 2/3 groups and quite stable situation below, but we don't see it too well because of the scale. The scale is in thousands of. So the tendency here is not so evident. You know, if we can then take the economic factors, for instance, the lack of subsidies for publishing and or the competition of other media. So, but basically, we see the growth in the number of players, but it doesn't sort of answer the idea whether it's just basically the more publishing, or we don't see here smaller or bigger publishers. So in order to, and again, sorry, just a quick detour. Okay. Yes. So in order to see this trend, I divided basically publishers and journals into big and small. And so if the critical assumptions were correct, we should see lots of small dispersed presses in the early 90s, and then subsequent market reconcentration towards the turn of the decade. So in order to differentiate between small and big ones, I took basically their annual publication numbers and applied the 90th percentile as a threshold. So that means that basically for me the big players were the 10% of the most prolific journals or publisher in a given year. So the 10% which would be mostly publish most books, and of course that means that every year, for instance, a given journal could be big or small depending on the number of production. I mean, this is the only way probably to do that, because we don't have. I mean, maybe there are others you may think of it, but basically we don't have, for instance, the information about the circulation, which would be helpful here. For instance, what we're basing on is just basically titles, and there are many journals. Perhaps we could try to quantitatively rate them as important or less important, but we don't have this data again. So I chose this 10% as the biggest, 10% of most publications as the threshold, just as a sort of the only measurement I could apply to differentiate between big and small. So we have two graphs here, just combined two graphs just to show you the discrepancy between the journals. So the big one shows the average number of books and articles published by publishers and journals. And in green you have big publishers, in red you have small publishers, in blue big journals, and yellow small journals. So basically the average number of books published by those entities, whereas here we have basically just the number of active publishers and journals. So you see, what's interesting for instance is our big publishers here. So as you can see, we have more of them in the beginning, and actually we have fairly, I mean visually you see that there's less of them towards the end of the decade, whereas the average number of books is getting higher for big publishers, which means that we have fewer big players, but they are responsible for larger literary output. And in terms of smaller publishers, the situation is quite similar from the beginning till the end. One mention should be made here that as for small publishers, we also in PBL we also sort of use we just take the literary books from certain publishers. So if there's like a big publisher in whatever history, but publish one edition, literary edition or whatever, it will be in PBL. But although it's a big publisher, for me it would be a small one because we have, for instance, only one book or two books per year from So this again, it's regarding literary culture. Okay, so moving towards, so just to conclude this part, so we may see something like this reconcentration of the market, but on those materials we don't see so much this narrative of so much of the recentralization in the beginning. I mean, we may see that there's a sort of dropped, for instance, the number of big journals. Of the pieces published by the big journals, and we see that the red line are small publishers, like getting more, we get more and more of those. But this is like something which we can get from this data, so something quite vague but showing certain tendencies. But it's getting a bit better later. So if we take into consideration literary reception, we may see something more here. So as you remember, the hypothesis number 2 reads that literary reception follows a similar pattern. So to analyze this tendency for centralizing the literary taste, we need to compare a number of books with their reception. So how many times a particular book is reviewed, discussed, or mentioned. And again, we just adjust the scale here. Okay. So now we have the number of book reviews relative to the publisher size. Blue books from big publishers, red books from small publishers. And see, we can see something interesting. So 89-90, we see that books from big publishers are like in the center of attention, and the small publishers, of course, the small publishers are just appearing like that, but we see this centralized taste. And then until more or less 97 here, we see this steady growth of interest in smaller publishers, but of course the subsequent growth of big ones too, but smaller publishers are like getting more attention. And then suddenly the trend sort of reverses, and we get this sort of recentralization in terms of literary attention. So basically more and more attention given to big players, to big publishers, and sort of decline in the attention given to books by small publishers. And it could be actually even better visible on this figure, but again, just let me adjust it for you. Okay. So now we have a ratio of book reviews compared with the number of books published. So just to tell you what we see here. So we have, first of all, the blue is number of books by big publishers, and the red is number of books by small publishers. So you can see the differences. And then the green line represents the number of book reviews of publications from small publishers divided by reviews of big publishers. So to make it simpler, the score above 1 means higher interest in small publishers, whereas value below 1, and using those numbers here, this means indicates that critical attention shifts towards big players. So basically if it's low, it's more into big players. So we can see again this trend that starting with critical attention toward big publishing, getting its peak, getting peak for interest in small books by smaller presses, and then we get back towards the like more centralized model. So using those measures, we may sort of recreate this narrative of critical attention and of those changes towards, of attitudes towards, in this case, like books published by larger or smaller publishers. And in order to better those relationships, we could also use some other measurements. In this case, actually, I tried to use the measurements from economy. So I don't know if you're familiar with the measure called the Gini coefficient, which is usually employed to measure inequality in societies. But we may sort of consider literary life as a system in which attention is given to authors in three ways: by publishing their books, by publishing their pieces in journals, and by writing about their work or about themselves, so critical attention. So measuring the distribution of this attention, distribution meaning how many, is it distributed equally, or there are like bigger players who concentrate more attention, may show us the level of equality of writers according to those variables. So, so we can see whether sort of critical attention or publishing is just, is equal, or are there any differences here. So just without like getting into too much detail, so Gini coefficient takes values between 0 and 1. So basically 0 means perfect equality. So for instance, all authors publish the same number of books, whereas 1 stands for the opposite, so absolute inequality. So one author publishes all the books, so that's the main difference. So and of course it's hardly surprising that literary culture is unequal. Oh, sorry, I forgot to adjust the slide again. Sorry. Because what you see here, and what you didn't see before, is that here we have, this is the level of 0.65, this is the level of like 0.5, so like the medium between 0, meaning perfect equality, and 1, meaning the perfect inequality. So the higher, the more unequal. So what we see here is the difference between actually books and articles published, which are more or less following similar patterns here, and the actual reviews and journal pieces, and the actual the authors of books, which is in this case the authors of books follow the like more sort of equal strategy, which may be due to the fact that we have also like lots of authors who publish just one book. I don't know actually how to explain this pattern, but it seems that the distribution of books, particularly, would be more equal in our data sets than in other parts. But the distribution of the journal pieces here follows like a sort of downward attention, like sort of towards equality, whereas the distribution of reviews follows like more this goes more towards inequality. So again, this concentration on fewer authors. But it's so we may see something here, but it's hard to say whether to what extent it's actually so meaningful. Actually, what we have here, but certain patterns could be visible. So moving to hypothesis 3, as you remember, we had debutocentrism and the return of the old masters in the 90s. So in order to test it, we basically we needed to create two groups of debutants and masters. And for the first part, I'm grateful to Czarek, who's here, who worked on this part, to get those authors who had not published anything before 1989, and we would consider them debutants. And on the other hand, we just took those, and it was like 3,900, quite a lot. And on the other hand, we took the group of masters, and this is of course the choice made on the basis of whatever knowledge of literary history, but the group of 11 authors who were really big in terms of who played a big role in the 90s, and they were also famous before 1989, so including Czesław Miłosz, Wisława Szymborska, Tadeusz Różewicz, Zbigniew Herbert, Stanisław Lem. So those names. And so first of all, we can see how the critical attention towards those authors is divided in general. So this is like publication and reception of masters. So this is the number of works published, and here is like both books and journal pieces. And here's the number of reception pieces, so how many times they were reviewed. And In blue you see the masters, in red they are debutants, and of course the largest group, so all other is not present in the in this dataset. So you can clearly see that all masters, perhaps except Tokarczuk, Stasiuk, Sośnicki for whatever reason, are getting lots of attention overall anyway, more than debutants. But this is like basically all the numbers from 1999-2002. But if we plot it over time, and we could see indeed some increase of interest in the in debutants, but then again it's also because of the fact that in the beginning we have like few debutants, so only in the 89 only those who published the first book in 89, and so on and so on. So so there's for sure the critical reception has to grow. And just sorry, I'm just adjusting it again. Yeah, so this is critical reception. So basically, percentage of all critical pieces, so reviews, etc., which were dedicated to those groups of authors. So in red, there are the percentage of the reception pieces dedicated to debutants, and in blue, percentage of reception pieces dedicated to the masters. So we see a certain growth here, but then suddenly debutants would overtake the masters. And this shows us actually, so we don't see clearly this pattern between debutantcentrism and return of the masters, but we see something else which is quite interesting in terms of our data sets, because we see certain like heights. For instance, this one. Could you guess what happened here? It's 1996. Basically, Szymborska got the Nobel Prize, and sort of single-handedly she sort of lifted the critical attention up here. Here's, I think, 2001. That would be the birthday of 19th birthday of Czesław Miłosz, which gathered like, lots of attention to him, and we see some spikes which basically draw attention to a certain author, which sort of destroy all those statistics we were working with here. The good example, another one which was I'm not showing you this particular graph, but for instance, when I was working with other data, I also had like a big spike in 1998, and I didn't know what to do with it, and it came out as basically there were like works dedicated to Mickiewicz next to his birthday, and we got around 1,000 like critical pieces or publications and so on. So just in comparison, Szymborska getting Nobel Prize got like 200 in our database, which is like a huge discrepancy. But it shows us something interesting, that when we work with this data, suddenly when we try actually working with data, we try to get a fuller picture, we still get those big names who attract attention, who attract critical attention, publish more, and sort of dominate the entire scene. So again, this part is sort of inconclusive, but then quite interestingly shows you that the red line is the percentage of attention given to almost 4,000 writers, and the blue dot gives you the attention given to 11 big writers, and it's more or less virtual. The percentages are quite similar with those spikes here, and I still don't know what this one means, 1991. Maybe we'll find out. Okay, moving towards geography, and which we're on our way to end. So the last hypothesis was the process of dispersion and recentralization also have a geographical dimension. So basically, it should be again visible as the rise and eventual decline of smaller publishing centers. So as the operationalization of this phenomenon, we assume that if the critics were right, we should witness the rise and subsequent decline of smaller publishing centers throughout the transformation period. So just to give you an example what we can do with the data, and sorry it's messy and again you don't see. Well, apparently here caption is in Polish, so it doesn't help much. But basically this is just a visualization of literary production in the geographical scope, and these are basically articles in books. These are articles in journals. These are books. So the numbers in comparison, which basically cities are more important here. And in the database, I worked with in the dataset I worked with 607 Polish cities, and tried to compute like the number of books published in each city or journals published in each city each year. And in order to distinguish between bigger centers and smaller centers, I used the same method as I used with the publishers. So basically, the biggest cities are those who had like 10% most publications, so the 10% of most publishing cities. So, and again, let me adjust it. So we can see this data here, and this comparison is probably hardly visible, but just try to walk you through this data. So the graph above, this one, shows you the number of works published in cities. The blue color signifies the high level of literary production, so big publishing city, big city, in other words. And red represents the cities with a low publishing level. And the squares are for books, and the circles are for journals. So we see that that basically having the cities with high literary production peaks more or less in the mid 90s, and then we get like subsequent decline of big literary sort of cities. Whereas if we look at the books in literary journals in the first part, we look at books, we see something quite perhaps opposite, so that we get a bit more cities with higher literary production. So this more sort of concentration in terms of geography. And then when we look at the same data but through different numbers, so number of cities publishing literary works. So here we look how many works were published. Here we look how many cities were publishing books. So we see that we see this sharp sort of growth, rise of the number of cities, of cities with small book publishing, so to say, which is also sort of interesting because according to our hypothesis, it should be a bit different, so that we would have like more of those probably around here, and we should probably see like a certain decline. However, the journal pieces, so cities with journals seem to follow this this path. So we get more small cities publishing journals, and then this number sort of declines over time. And this one, just to show you the basically just to see to measure the market concentration with another measurement from the economy, which is Hirschman index. Probably not getting into too much detail with this for now, but here we can see that sort of the book market measured by basically the number of cities publishing journals and books is sort of getting lower, like towards certain equality. So from centralized model towards decentralized, but we don't see the in this, at least in those numbers in this picture, we don't see this sort of trend towards recentralization as it was visible. Okay, and last thing I just wanted to share with you, and we'll finish with basically using something else here with those works, basically the network analysis, because as you know, we having all those relationships between authors and books, we may try to picture them on the network. And this this is actually what literary system is about connection between entities, connections between institutions. So this sort of graph I showed you earlier, that we may find those connections. And again, without getting into too much detail, but just to show you the crucial difference for one last thing I'm just going to show you, just the difference between multimodal networks and monomodal networks. So multimodal networks, in this case, for instance, this would be the let's say book publisher, and these are the authors. So they all publish with the same publisher. So we have the network. In this case, it's a two-mode network. So we have two types of entities. So again, we can have more publishers, and this author could publish with another publisher, etc. But the same entities would never be connected with each other. So I mean, because the relationship would be about publishing. So these are connected this way, and we can translate such method such network into the network of authors. So basically, what those three authors have in common is that they publish with the same publisher. So we just remove publishers, but translate this connection into the connection between the authors. This is the simplest way to get you there, because in trying to work with this data, I try to work on both types of connections. This is how we can visualize the network of this is with creators, authors, creators meaning literary authors meaning reviewers, publishers and journals, but again, it doesn't tell us much. I just wanted to show that it's possible to visualize it. I'm still working on just getting something meaningful out of those visualizations. But what I worked with, and again, this is it's a bit nicer, but again, almost equally meaningful. This is a network of authors, relationship between all authors in this period, and the colors sort of represent certain groups. I mean, grouped by an algorithm, but again, it doesn't tell you and tell me anything. But this is previous future work actually what you're looking for. And again, so you can compare the networks of 89 and 96. I mean, visually there may be some differences, but you know, it's like it's just a matter maybe of course. I mean, what's different, and this is just a footnote, is actually we get more smaller sort of communities in this other part. So this is like a sort of difference, but I'm not getting into that right now. I just wanted to show you this graph because I think it is interesting, and it sort of shows those relationships we have in the critical writing. So this graph shows basically the certain statistics computed for networks, which is average degree. And average degree basically, how to put it to make it like really. Average degree would be basically the measure of sort of connections in the yeah, something like, just to find the proper word for that. Basically, each okay. So basically, the network, the degree of each node, meaning each entity in the network, is the number sort of connections this network, this person or institution or whatever has. And the average degree is basically how much on average, how many connections those entities on the network have. So then the assumption would be the higher the average degree, the more sort of centralized the network, meaning the more sort of every element is connected to more elements or knows more people. So in this, so the author like publishing in, so many authors publishing in the same institution, for instance, and many reviewers concentrating on the same authors, etc. So this would be this measurement. So that would mean in this sort of cohesion. So what we see here, there are two measurements. They're on different scales, but I'm omitting it for now. So the orange one is made for one mode network, so we need network of connections between authors only. So just this sort of translation of this graph with institutions to the graph of connections between people. And the red one is computed for this two-mode network, meaning people and institutions. And both show more or less similar narrative from this sort of huge number of connections, the more and more clustered network, towards certain dispersion, and then sort of getting back there with those differences here. So this one is like sort of fairly fresh work right here. What I'm planning to do with this is just move those hypotheses farther and just to work a bit more with the networks themselves, basically. So yeah, so let's leave it for now and just go towards the conclusions. So so the conclusion is that the approach is quite promising. But you see that on some of those statistics we managed to sort of replicate those trends described by the critics. But overall, it's still sort of messy. I mean, it's still difficult. I mean, to show that okay, yeah, we have this first trend, like this dispersion is clearly visible. This recentralisation is again clearly visible. As you can see, in some cases we sort of approach towards those conclusions, but not everywhere, and not so much as we probably would expect. So there's a big bunch of problems behind it, and let's just try to quickly address some of them. So first of all, the claims of the critics. So I based it on the claims of the scholars, which I like, but then again, we may think to what extent they're depictions of the actual literary life, or to what extent they're also sort of prescriptive. And I actually computed that from amongst the authors scholars I quoted in the beginning, I have in the data set, they constitute like almost 2% of reviewers. So they were also sort of writing about literature in that time, so they're also in the data set. So in a way, they're writing about the literary system, but also they sort of making an intervention into it. So we cannot take those claims and, you know, as something like, you know, the absolute truth. Another thing is the chronological bias on certain levels, but in the case of critics, that sometimes they were writing sort of in, let's say, mid-2000s or whatever, so looking back at certain phenomena. So again, they would try to show certain processes which maybe didn't actually exist, but they felt that they can interpret what happened in this way. And the third thing, also, they use those catchy metaphors. Of course, they want to be distinctive, but the metaphors are nice, but sometimes they also sort of blur the actual phenomenon we want to tackle. The second bunch of problems is the source material, meaning the bibliography, which is in itself a construct. So on one hand, we use critical discourse, which is a construct, it's trying to depict literary life, but on the other, we're using bibliographical data, which sort of tries to be objective, but of course it's also interpretable. For instance, in this way that bibliographers have to work with the definition of literature, right? That this is literature, this is not literature, this is not our field. So again, we're working with a certain construct, and we see that maybe those constructs are not too compatible. And of course, there are certain human mistakes in the data, but of course, in this huge data set, probably they're not so much important. But the main problem for me and for our data set here is the lack of comparative data, because I think probably it would be better to see, for instance, if we had at least 5 years back in the 80s, just to see the centralization narrative. So that would be the that's something we miss. And the last bunch of problems is the construct which emerges from the data, from what I did with the data. So first of all, that we are sort of modeling temporality, so we're trying to measure certain phenomena in certain years. But again, as we know as scholars, that the fact that a certain book or journal piece is published in this year, not in the next year or the last year, is sometimes a matter of chance. But we have to use this number, those years, as a certain whole, right? So again, working with those, with this data again is sort of pushing us towards this chronological thing. And the last thing is the problem of scale, and this is a really nice metaphor. I learned from one of the colleagues at the Stanford Literary Lab of the sort of the great unread, meaning this huge bunch of literary authors that nobody actually read, nobody, but people didn't read, people didn't write about. This huge number of actually literary production we have in bibliographies, but which didn't sort of was not appreciated by critics, was never sort of visible. So once you take everything into consideration, so not only big writers, but also canonical writers, but also all the rest, again, this picture sort of gets blurry. I mean, you get maybe too much data. So it's a problem with scale. It's something we may also call like too big data. So we have like too many phenomena, as in the case of the of those networks. So again, when we compare, this is the network sort of modernist authors from one of the articles by London. So, and we compare it to our sort of hedgehog here, you see that perhaps like working on smaller data sets may be sort of more meaningful. And of course, I can filter our network and do lots of stuff with this, but sometimes maybe the working on a smaller scale can give you like sort of more meaningful results. And I think that would be the last point I would like to make. So thank you very much for your attention.
So, thank you, Maciej, for your very inspirative speech. It's really interesting for us because at our current project concerning analyzing of literary internet, we are trying to develop some statistical tools which will describe the bibliographical data or the bibliographical data set, so it could be very inspirative for us for our own research. And maybe I can open the discussions, and please, if anybody has any question, the floor is yours.
Maybe just for a start, I thank you for your paper, and not to the presentation itself, but to its origin.
Yeah.
You said that you did your research at Stanford, and I suppose that you were working with Literary Lab.
Yeah.
After Moretti in this year, because he was leaving a year ago, I think.
Yeah.
So, if you can tell something about your personal experience, atmosphere and so on.
Yeah, I mean, so what can I, we were recording it, I know, I can go on record now. It was a really great experience.
Cut it.
What's interesting about the lab itself is that, I mean, one the lab is small, and as you said, Franco Moretti is not with the lab anymore, and Mark Algie Hewitt is the director of that, I think, since 2 or 3 years already. But there's this quite small group of actual people working there like full time. I think it's director to associate directors of the lab. and the manager, but then the rest is basically our people coming for visits or graduate students. So they sort of cooperate on various projects, and they have like plenty of projects, and not all of them are sort of concluded. But what's the main, I think, main feature of Literary Lab would be this really sort of collaborative spirit of work. So if you want to contribute, you can join every project. There are lots of meetings. You can try to jump in. And the main feature of their work would be like sort of high like methodological conscience. So they're not so much interested in doing or replicating their stuff on other sort of materials, but rather more in developing certain methods that could match the critical ideas they have. So they start with like the problem, and they just try to find the measures and tools to get the answer. It's not the other way around. So not that, oh, we've got this great new software, let's try it on those novels. But rather they're asking questions which are like at the root are really about literary studies, are really theoretical questions, and you just try to operationalize them, just to try to answer them on the literary material, although they're mostly also invested in the textual studies. But they had like one project remotely close to the data we have, but it's mostly based on canon, based on Northern anthologies, but it's like mostly like just taking the index of content from all the anthologies and looking for patterns. I mean, who's in the anthology, who's not, and just to show the history of sort of literary studies in the States. But yeah, but mostly it's textual for this.
Next question, please.
Okay. Maciej, you employed statistics, the statistical method, to verify or falsify the hypotheses derived from what would we call interpretive criticism.
Yeah.
Could these methods be employed for posing some new hypotheses, or to somehow get beyond this area of verifying hypotheses set by the standard criticism or so?
Yeah, thanks for this question. Actually, this is the aim here, because I wanted to start somewhere, and so I just thought, okay, the best thing would be to start with certain assumptions and see if this works. And as you see, it's sort of like both ways. But and now but like through this work on the stuff I showed you here, I realized the big potential of this data, and especially probably on this field of network and analysis, because it's really rich and it's really interesting. But this is like something, as you mentioned, something that should go through a different direction. So like just starting to first of all like conceptualize this literary life a bit differently. So just also like thinking about all those smaller authors, smaller players who somehow contribute, and just try to create a model of literary life, which is not based on the previous criticism, but just stems sort of from the data we have. So this is actually like something I'm trying, once I get rid of all the all the papers I have to finish and stuff like this is like the first thing I want to do. So just try to work towards this. So just try to find new ways of analyzing this data set. So not through this lens of previous criticism. And I think it's fruitful, and it would be also interesting to see if it could be somehow also applied to your data as well. I mean, just for the comparative perspectives, just to see what we can have, because like if we look at the data we have, and this could also come back at least for a second to the experience of the literary lab. I mean, what we have, what we're rich in, is the actual data. They meaning probably like Anglo-Saxon, but basically Americans as well. They don't have such rich data sets. I mean, literary ones, like sort of curated ones. Of course, there are, for instance, there's like a JSTOR data set of secondary literature, but in terms of like the curated work, they don't usually have such things, and for instance, they have to establish ones for themselves. I mean, there's one guy, graduate student, who's working on literary awards, so he has to collect all this stuff from the awards, and in our bibliographies we have plenty of this information. So this is a certain, I think, advantage, but also this data we have is so rich that we may try to develop like new ways of looking at the relationships in literary life, because it's because it's so rich. It's not like prepared small data set like the one I just showed you here, which is, I mean, of course, this is a pretty interesting study of, but it's based on, this network is based on modernist authors, poets actually publishing in the same journals. But it's like, yes, I think let's say it's like 10 journals, and of course it's lots of work, but it's like, I think it's a two-man job, like for those guys who did it for probably a couple of weeks or months, but still it's a very small range, so we can try to do it on a bigger scale, but then we need those tools or methods to actually try to do something meaningful with this data inside other than this. So we should work on it.
Maybe I will pose my question. I want to ask on the graph when you were doing a comparison between old masters and the debutants.
Yeah.
I want to ask your definition of debutant. If I understand good, was that debutant is any person who has published his or her first book after 1989.
Yeah, more or less. No, starting with 1989. So
generally, somebody who started to publish in, I don't know, 1990, still be in your comparison debutant also to 2000.
So this is why it's sort of biased, because every year we get more debutants here.
Yeah. This was a discrepancy that I feel when I see this graph, because you are comparing the constant group of the old masters and then the growing and always growing group of the of the debutants.
What I planned to do and didn't manage, but I should and will, would be also just look at particular debutants. And I think, I mean, Tokarczuk, whom we mentioned, is like one of the best examples really of a debutant who's actually making a career. And again, this is like one sort of strain of research I want to look, so just try to describe the career trajectory through bibliographical data, because you have the first publication, first critical attention, first awards, etc. This is like something you can build on, and maybe you build some model of this literary career. And I also was thinking whether we can have different models in those periods, right? So that perhaps, for instance, there would be more, let's say, centralized model of career later on, like, for instance, somebody getting popular through coverage in mass media and big newspapers, etc. So yeah, this is something that to be looked at. But for this, we need to, again, somehow discriminate between types of journals and things like that. But so it's still like lots of work. But yeah.
Thanks. And maybe one related question. When we were doing some comparison of the authors, for example, from the 50s,
we have seen strong tendency in the situation when some of the authors have celebrating some birthday or some anniversary. Then the articles growing very rapidly high and then it's falling very rapidly low. So was it the same case?
Yeah. So this is like exactly. Actually, Szymborska's case is interesting, but I don't like have numbers here, but I remember. So she would get like in this 1998 when she got the 1996 when she got the Nobel Prize, she would get like 200 reviews, and the previous year she would get like critical attention like around like 20. So that's like a high peak. Next year, I think it was like something like 120, then it would be like 60, and then I think after 3 years, she would, which was like quite surprising for me, she would get back more or less into the same point that she were before the Nobel Prize. So then again, you see, first of all, this peak, but then later sort of fading of the attention. So what we see here with the Masters is basically those events, like this Miłosz birthday here, I think is like 2000. Here, I think it's Herbert here. Herbert.
Yeah, wait 1 year because we will be processing 2004. Miłosz dies. So
yeah, I was like so puzzled, like what happened here? And then suddenly it's like I looked at that really the 90th birthday of Miłosz was like so much celebrated because I think everybody was expecting it as like last birthday or something, but he got like lots of attention, but also like lots of awards or whatever. So this was this peak. 2000 was Henryk Grudziński's death, but it didn't get, so it gets like some pike, and 1998 was the death of Herbert, but nothing would match the birthday of Mickiewicz, which is like totally, like 5 Nobel Prizes, 5 Szymborskas. It was also like shocking actually.
A lot of dailies speak about like people like Mickiewicz and a lot of like events around constant.
That's one thing, and actually we didn't touch upon this when talking about debutants and masters, and of course there's a huge group of others, and also like lots of critical attention will be dedicated to like Mickiewicz, Sienkiewicz, or all those authors of 19th century or big authors of like early 20th century. And again, this is something when we're thinking with numbers, it's also something like difficult sort of to conceptualize, because in those stories we're like focusing sort of on those authors, trying at least to focus on contemporary literary life. But then again, the part of literary life is literary tradition, which is still somewhere there, and there's still critical attention towards, etc. So this is something I really didn't sort of touch upon, but perhaps again it would be something that maybe when doing all those graphs I should have, for instance, removed all those authors who were not sort of active participants of literary life, maybe because they were dead. But again, in doing so, that would be like for us like a huge endeavor, because I mean, of course, it would be easy with Mickiewicz or whatever. That's easy, but with all those smaller, I mean, it's not so eminent authors, it's really hard, as we don't have, in most cases, we don't have birthdays and deaths. So that would be painful, like when you work with 20,000 names, right? It's and in many cases we don't know them at all. I mean, you just look at the name and you never heard of this author. So that's again a big obstacle, which shows us that although we have the data, we still have those obstacles to manage when we want to do something. So we have to be aware, just like this point I made in the beginning, so that although we have this data, we should be aware of all those problems around it. And this is like one of them, that there's lots of noise from those other authors.
You have mentioned that bibliography itself is a construct. While curating your data set, did you take into consideration the changing range or scope of your bibliography? Because I can imagine that 1 year you have 5 bibliographers. And the second year you will have only 1 due to some budget cuts or so. And this somehow changes proportions of within the data set, you know.
In our case, it was also like the question of methodology. And actually, I had like one situation like as you mentioned, that I started to do some graphs, and then I think, I don't remember, maybe perhaps it was Charlie who actually told me that with 1989 the methodology changed a bit, and certain, or it was like 1990, I don't remember actually which was the exact thing, but it really doesn't matter. Just to give you the example that at a certain point the methodology changed, and some journals were dropped. So in order to sort of maintain the same data set, I basically removed those journals also from previous years, so just to stay focused, so we don't have this, because I remember this first data set with this drop between 89 and 90 was like really a bit more significant, also because of the fact that some method changed. And of course, on the way, there are some decisions and change in methodology. However, the idea was with our bibliography that it still sort of maintains the more or less a similar base, although it costs us.
So those years are processed according to the same rules. So it's more like processing may take longer, but the methodology stays basically the same. So there might be years, especially in the 90s, which, for example, there was a shocking explosion of publications. It took like 2 years, but the methodology was the same. So it's not like we have to finish and like in a year, for example, so we have to cut like the number of journals, or we change methodology according to it. So it's rather constant here, but there are specific issues that are controversial from some point. For example, we make a change in processing like some kind of information, and it might be, and the result might be spiking very specific, not in large scale, it probably wouldn't, be significant, but in some specific case it might be. For example, we decide that we will, so there was a case, one example, so there are regional periodicals of libraries in which they describe literary life regionally. So there was a decision that we will, like there are, for example, 2-3 pages of descriptions of events, and there was a decision that each event will be considered as one record at some point, and it makes them some quite big publishers, like, because 20-30 records from one journal that's librarian journal is not literary journal, but in numbers it's like, literary significant journal, but it's, so a lot of this kind of cases, and it may, and one of the cases it might be significant, might be significant.
Another such example would be this level of books, because we have like also lots of, or mostly those poetry books, right? Like small ones published by those either small publishers or like cultural centers, and I think there's a lot of this, but there's no sort of easy way of actually getting rid of, or just removing them and doing the work with the other stuff. And I think it's probably visible a lot in those statistics, for instance, of books in smaller cities. So I think it's in most cases perhaps the poetry books are responsible for that. Or in the case when I showed you that there were those inequalities in journals and reviews, but books were like sort of more equal, so like meaning that more people would write the same amount of books, and of course it means that it's hard probably to publish lots of books each year. Even with 3 editions, but it's one point. But also, I think it's also because of the fact that there's like many small authors, so like one publish, for instance, one book in the entire data set or whatever, but every year you get a lot of stuff like this. And I was thinking about actually like just getting rid of it in a way, just because it's sort of blurs the picture. But then again, this is also the part of the picture, so it's not an easy decision to dismiss those small ones, because again, this is like this part of those great unread. So this is this context where everything was sort of published and floating, and if you just arbitrarily get rid of something, it could distort the picture. So yeah, so there are those choices we need to make. But of course, in the beginning, we should know basically the methodology, because it will allow us to know what sort of conclusions we can make with the data we have, and what, for instance, something could mean that there's like more attention to those authors because there was a birthday or something like this.
Thank you. Is there any other question, note, remark?
Ask channels.
I was just thinking, but you have this picture here. You said that there is maybe the only one possibility, which is not true now.
Yeah.
I see that one of the lines has to be a timeline. But I'm just thinking this is not true. You just can make your to precise the research. You precise the actually the things or the characteristics of the points on the lines, and then you don't have then a timeline or something which is changeable in the time, but you can have something which is more like plastic, you know?
Yeah, I mean, network is like this. Although I also created networks, but I mean, it's an example to show this what you said, but also to counter an argument, because I also created networks, like 40 networks for each year. And again, this is something, okay, this is like this literary system of 1995, for instance. But then, how arbitrary is this? Because you may not have certain authors, because for instance they didn't publish in this year, or this author like published more, so now he or she is in the center, etc. So this is not a problem. I mean, you're perfectly right that and probably this gives you more overview. It's more stable if you look at the whole decade, for instance. But if you try to compare those years, it's like so the graphs. For instance, I was thinking for those graphs, for instance, that sometimes what you do with the data is that you use this sort of movable average. So in Google Ngrams they use this. So this value would be the average of, like, for instance, the year before and the year after. So that would sort of flatten it, so you don't get these shapes, and will give you like sort of the more like continuous stuff. But then again, you wouldn't see Szymborska that well, like Nobel Prize, because that would be a sort of the flat surface. So these are those advantages and disadvantages. But I was thinking actually how to, but probably you're right. It is on the other hand, if you look at the literary system as like 10 years, and there's again a question why 10, why not 20? We don't have data for that, but again, this is a construct which with certain, you have to know what's in it. What you can see, you cannot. But this thing about time is still like bothering me, because I don't think it would be a good approach to how to handle this arbitrariness of those.
It was more critics.
Yeah, but sure, this whole view actually gives us something more. But but of course, the goal of this study, which was to look at those claims about the evolution of literary life, sort of pushed me towards chronology. So that's what.
Yeah, sure, of course, because it's a historical item.
Yeah, and the history of literature.
Just the question, so the masters that are only living authors.
Living, but famous. So authors who were already famous for whatever reason before 1989. And of course, it was like basically I chose them like based on the knowledge of literature. Yeah, but
I think that the question of Szymborska is that's the consequence of your choice. That you have only 11 masters and a big amount of debutants.
Yeah.
So I think you have to create small groups with in the middle of debutants.
Yeah.
That debutant is only for 2 years. You have a flow identity of these entities. It's I think a good approach to it. So if you have flowing identities, you can take the identity of debutant only for 2 years. So you can connect Tokarczuk only 1 year. She debuted with first book, and she's a debutant for this year and another year. So now you have a smaller group or divided group of debutants, and
for each year. You're right. Yeah.
Maybe you forgot the old masters, dead masters, because publishing houses are recycling the old classic and so on, and that's I think that's a way how to achieve a bigger amount of masters. I'm just thinking about it.
But in this case, the masters were like derived from those claims of critics, and they were quite specific. It was about literary life, which basically so again the concept was that in the first half people were looking for like great debutants, but sort of didn't find like too many, and then turned towards the living, but the great writers were already great, so they sort of paid more attention to those ones. But I mean, you are right. I was thinking about this approach with debutants, that you probably would have to take debutants from this year, or whatever. But again, the claim would be it's more about. It's not like about debutants like for a certain year, and for sure you wouldn't get like if you write your first book here, you wouldn't get like lots of attention now. But it's more about like the group of sort of new people, like new authors,
I think that your approach to your data is prefigure.
Oh
in this way that you want to confirm some hypothesis.
But
so that's the reason for you was the main feature to be a master before 1989 and to be new after 1989. But the literary field is much more complex, and so the researcher have to look at it, at the flowing of the data and so on. Not only in the direction in some hypotheses, but to look at his data and searching if there should be some new approaches, some new hypotheses.
I mean,
there is a strong prefigurement of the data set.
But this is like something, of course, I sort of looked for basing on the previous claims. You're right, but also there's an interesting thing to mention here that those numbers are on the same scale, meaning the percentage of the attention, right? And this line is more or less for the red line is for 3,000 authors, and this one is for 11 authors. So that means that even if we get, as you said, like good sort of debutants like Tokarczuk or other like new authors who got some attention, they would be still like really low. So it's sort of uncomparable, but it sort of falsifies the claim made before and allows us to look for other approaches. And I think, of course, I was thinking about what you mentioned with those years. Also, like just to trace those trajectories. So just look, for instance, at Tokarczuk, like when she got her debut. So what sort of attention she got there, and this sort of. So just to look at her path, for instance, not without other.
Gini said that the nice approach would be to sort of complicate further certain, because it tells us something, but from my perspective of documentalists or bibliographers, so maybe make this data more aware of types of documents that we derive information from. So, for example, the masters might be more might be more popular in dailies. Dailies are published daily, so it's a lot of records, right? There's a lot of that. Even a good writer who is not famous, he will be in a monthly or quarterly, and you know, you might many quarterlies, important quarterlies may write about it, and it's still not quantitatively comparable to daily. When you have, for example, because it's a running joke among the bibliographers, right? There's, for example, we had a situation when they stole some fresk from Schultz, right? And it was like 20 records, you know, everyone has something about it every day, you know, it's like running joke. Did you have something about it? Yeah, it's like for 2 or 3 months, you know, this situation in dailies goes around and around.
And because suddenly Schultz is like
and suddenly he may be, you know, somewhere, and you know, this, and for a good writer to produce 30 records in literary quarterlies, he might be like a huge phenomenon, a literary artistic phenomenon. So the nice approach would be like to make it sort of aware of the types of documents. And
but there is a problem because you cannot be aware of everything. But it's right. It's probably like one approach would be to differentiate between attention from dailies and the attention from like quarterly journals or yearbooks or whatever, because it's unequal. But in this data set, actually, we treat it as equal. So this is like probably the case of Mickiewicz, that he gets a lot of attention because basically dailies would write about the events or about his work or whatever. So he got lots of attention, which is probably like you know, lots of small notes. But you get like, for instance, writer debutant who would get like 3 pieces, but they're like big essays about her works. It would go unnoticed in this approach. So we have to find a way to further sort of differentiate between those types of attention we have. I mean, we have genres. I mean, I know we can say whether it's an interview or it's a review or something, but it's probably we need to start with actually sort of sorting the list of journals, so we would have, because it would be not so difficult, but not that many of them, so less than publishers. So we can try to name them so we can differentiate between types of attention, to weigh this attention. But yeah, that's a big problem, sure.
Maciej, you finished your experiment just a year or 2 before the internet started to play today's role in communication. Do you have some ideas of how would your trends, lines proceed after 2003 or so?
And that's also a problem of data. I mean, we just submitted, I mean, and now we're resubmitting actually the grant to, because we're getting to the point we just start to do internet research, I mean, in internet bibliography as well. It's sort of, before us, we don't have data for that. What I would expect also from sort of studies I did from Literary Life Online for my research, that we would get probably different sort of kind of authors, those authors who were like really active online and getting some attention, and we probably would get more like communities like revolving around those online authors, which are not exactly similar or comparable to the printed communities. That could be like totally different. There could be no sort of connection between them. And this is what I would expect happens. But it's like another huge. So in a way, I'm sort of happy with the literature here, because it's another huge methodological challenge. You know, how to compare those circulations. Right now, I would say we live in a time when it's more or less equal or becoming equal. You know, let's say 10 years from now, we wouldn't. I mean, already differentiated between online and offline is sort of odd, and in 10 years I think we wouldn't even think about it. But then in this time, especially like 2000, I mean in Poland, for instance, I think 2006 is more or less sort of the really turning point. There's like lots of blogs appearing at that time, lots of stuff going on, and then for the next few years there's a lot of literary thing, but it was completely, or something in most cases, different from the official or the printed circulation. So I would expect those differences. But then, of course, after this time, you would see that many authors who got like sort of also famous online would reappear in the offline or the printed circulation, because in most cases the online presence was sort of preparation for getting printed. I don't know if it's still. I mean, it's probably still it's like this, that, you know, it's like even if you're famous online, it's like you want to print a book, or some people that would print their blogs, right? So there's still the thing. But in the early days, I would say it was like really clearly visible that they want to, and still they use the internet to get attention, to actually move towards the printed circulation. But this is also something that could be actually mapped using the data. But for now, we will use your data, our data. But yeah, I would say, but I don't know.
We have two numbers. So right now, in 2004, out of 850 journals that we process, 4 went completely online. 4, like they resigned from the printed version and went online 4 right now. And we had just one more, but really preliminary data we get from nieszuflada.pl, which is a famous website for publishing. We will with Wojta about this in Torino, that publishes poetry online from 2002 to up to now. So that's very preliminary. So we got all the authors from that site, for 25,000 writers approximately, and we run it against our data authors. But of course, it's a really, it's not, it doesn't give you a whole lot of sense, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because our database is up to 2003, but we got like 450 hits that might be the same person from nieszuflada, that he or she exists in our database. Yeah, but it's the only thing we could do, having this data and having nieszuflada, which is easy to get data from. So right, but we have to, and we run it also against National Library authors, and we got like 800 hits from it. So it's like something, but again, to analyze it, we will have like weeks or months of work to decide whether he or she, who has the same name, is the same person, and is completely different stuff with online ephemeral websites when you can change your name, for example.
And I would also expect that many of those authors who are publishing those like poetry in small journals or small poetry books in small publishers, they would move online, or at least they would be. I would expect for our numbers that we have a decrease in those ephemeral poetry publications in the. I mean, of course, they are still there, but I think in the numbers, I think they will move online. For instance, to such portals as you mentioned, nieszuflada, like many others, because it's a cheaper or actually better way to get the audience, because they would create communities. This is what I would expect. I mean, we'll test it once we have the data for that. So like before retirement, probably. And not in 7 years, but probably a bit later. But we hope we will get there with PPL, so just to test it.
Yes. So maybe space for the last question. If not, so Maciej, I want to thank you once again for your great speech.
Yeah. Thank you for great questions, and then actually, like also noting that we'll use it. So thanks for the discussion and for having me.